consumption is zero. The amount of energy flowing out of the building is equal to the amount of energy flowing into the building. A simple accounting concept, one would think, but we need to question whether this approach is the right solution to the bigger picture. There are many concerns that have been raised over the years. Sorry, I think somebody's mic is still on somewhere. There's many concerns that have been raised over the years. Back in 2008, a lot of the research people in Europe, for example, started wondering about the detrimental impact that net zero buildings could have on the performance of the grid, especially when we look at high penetration levels. It's all very well when you only have 1 or 2 buildings on your feeder on your grid that push energy back into the grid. But once you've got a neighborhood of buildings, what are we looking at? And we know that the Rocky Mountain Institute, the RMI, of course, had many concerns about net zero, and they've addressed that along with BIPSA and ASHRAE, as you will see. So when we look at the typical load profile of a building over a year, 52 weeks, 365 days of load profile, we soon realize that we need to drill down into the load profile of one day and try and understand the effects of a net zero building. So yeah, we have the load profile. You can see down the bottom here, this is 0 kilowatts. And clearly overnight, the building uses some baseline energy load, and around about 6 in the morning, the energy load shoots up and then drops at about 6 at night, all the way back down to the baseline level. Now, what would happen if we introduced photovoltaics, say rooftop PV, to this particular building? Well, we're starting to head towards a net zero building, because a net zero building needs to push just as much energy back into the grid as it consumes. So here we have a typical day, and you can see, whilst not pushing back just as much energy as it consumes, there certainly is an amount of energy flowing back into the grid. And that's because you have a PV output. You can see the profile here centered around the middle of the day. Now, one of the issues that comes to mind, of course, is in the real world, we have a PV output that isn't a smooth curve. And here we have a PV output for a cloudy day. And you can see that it's as the clouds move over the panels, the cloud front speed is easily 4 or 5 meters a second. So you can very easily obscure a complete PV system in a very short space of time. Now, when you take that PV output and marry it with the load, you're going to find that, roughly speaking, your load on the grid is going to be up and down all the time. And this leads to many, many issues, especially at substation level. Your tap changes on the transformers are up and down all the time. Typically, they're only designed to change maybe twice a day, and this could be happening many, many times a day. So a typical net zero building could put quite a load onto the grid, and we need to understand a bit more about this. If we look at energy consumption over a period of a week, we start to understand that net zero energy buildings may not scale. And by this I mean, if you had a whole neighborhood of net zero buildings, what would the impact be? So we've got a traditional building here. We can see the load profile over a 24-hour period, and down the bottom here we can see the weekly load profile. If we take this further and we look at a building using some PV, a small amount of PV for self-consumption, you can see that in theory it may want to feed a small amount of energy back into the grid. That's if the grid allows it to feed back energy. So this is not a net zero building. It's a building looking to supplement its energy load, its energy consumption, by having a small amount of PV in the middle of the day. And you can see the weekly profile down the bottom here. This particular building doesn't operate over weekends, the Saturdays and the Sundays in this case. And our next step is to start imagining what would happen if we had a net zero energy building. Now, in order to push the same amount of energy back into the grid that it receives over the period of the year, it means this building must have a much larger PV installation. And as you can see, it actively will attempt to push a large amount of energy back into the grid. And typically what happens, of course, is over weekends, there's a good deal of energy flowing back into the grid, as you can see down the bottom here. What this really means is we certainly do need to understand whether the grid itself can make use of this energy. So the first thing we need to understand is, whilst we should be looking to ensure that buildings can seek beneficial coexistence with the grid, we've got to understand that the net zero approach assumes, it's a theoretical approach maybe, and it assumes that in an ideal world, you've got a magical grid which will have infinite capacity and also be run by a benevolent charity that is willing to take your meager amounts of self-generated energy at a moment's notice, and of course with fabulous reward, because that's the reason why you're going to push energy back into the grid. Now, of course, in the real world, it's a very different picture. A neighborhood full of so-called green buildings covered in rooftop photovoltaics may produce excess energy, especially in the middle of the day, and may find that the grid is unwilling to pay for this amount of energy. So a lot of concern revolves around whether net zero buildings can scale. It's all very well having one or two on your feeder, but what happens if every building on your feeder is now trying to play the net zero game? So I think at this point, a lot of researchers around the world started looking at a different way of doing things. And I must admit that one of the better articles, believe it or not, that came out about these issues is a paper published by ASHRAE, I think it was in around about 2018, called The New Energy Future. It was put together by Sheila Hayter, who was the ASHRAE president at the time, and Hugh Crowther, ASHRAE member, and working together with the American Institute of Architects and other players in the space, they put together what has really become a very important position paper about where our new energy future is going. And the paper notes in particular that the grid has buildings as probably their most important customer, and these buildings are more than likely to become active grid partners. Now, you've heard from Rena and the Indian Smart Grids Forum that we're heading towards a world where the grid will be smart. It will have a number of intelligent capabilities, the ability to communicate, and a number of benefits flow from that. So how do the buildings integrate? What this paper did focus on is the need for change in the way we design and operate buildings, and especially on the need for net zero energy buildings to evolve. If anybody asks me what a grid integrated or a grid interactive energy efficient building is about, I always tend to tell them that one should think of a net zero building that's grown up. What would a net zero building want to be when it grows up? And certainly grid integrated or grid interactive, interchangeable words there. Certainly the GEBS building is where the industry is going. Now, this is a pretty neat definition from the Rocky Mountain Institute, and they really see a grid integrated or grid interactive energy efficient building as a building that has communication and a lot of two-way interaction with the grid. The focus is on the money. The focus is on how to save costs for both parties, the building owners and, of course, the operators of the grid. And if the building can be responsive to changes, then not only can the carbon intensity be reduced, but clearly there's the opportunity to improve the savings and hence profits. A very good paper has also been published, and you'll find a link at the end of this slide presentation as well, on the economics of grid interactive efficient buildings. And you can see that the definition that they focus on is, of course, a optimized blend of energy efficiency on one hand, energy storage, renewable energy generation, and load flexibilities to ensure that this building has a flatter and even a more flexible energy profile. How do they do this? How is all of this going to work? Well, it's all about the flexibility that can be provided. Clearly, we want to reduce the actual load profile, and we don't want to waste energy. So energy efficiency is vitally important. The first step of moving towards a GEB is to reduce your load profile, looking at energy efficiency issues. Secondly, you can start playing the game of shedding, shifting and shaping your load profiles. And yeah, we can see that moving the shedding the load, dropping the load if you don't need it, shifting the load profile from the middle of the day into the early morning perhaps. And then lastly, we've got something called grid services, such as sub-second modulation, the ability to provide voltage stabilization to the grid. Can you imagine that? The buildings itself can assist the grid or the local feeder in terms of the power quality, a very important aspect that grid engineers are always looking at. So if you had to ask me what the grid interactive efficient building is about, the first step would be efficiency, then add self-generation in the building, as much generation perhaps as you think is profitable, rather than attempting to be a net zero building, and then starting to move and shift the loads around so that you get as flat a profile as you can, because that's typically how you're going to reduce your maximum demand costs, shifting your time of use, energy usage into the middle of the night, and you can do a lot of things to improve the profitability of your building. Now, the key characteristics of a GEB, as we've said, it starts with efficiency. You're looking at persistent low energy use. This has got to be something that continues. Measurement and verification play a big part. The need for proper commissioning of these buildings to reduce the energy usage, make them more efficient, is important. Next up is a connection, a two-way communication with the grid itself via a number of technologies. You're probably well aware that we're moving into a world of 5G, of internet connectivity, Internet of Things, IoT. The benefit of being connected, of course, is your building can start to understand how tariffs are changing, because we're also moving into a world where we have dynamic pricing. The kilowatt hour is dead. The whole idea of a fixed kilowatt hour charge is just about over. In future, the price of energy will depend on the supply. When the wind blows and the sun shines, a lot of renewables will come onto the grid, and that'll be available at a much cheaper price. So dynamic pricing means that your building has to be in contact with the grid to understand these issues. Looking ahead, the look-ahead market, if you know the wind's going to blow tomorrow and the sun is going to shine, the price of energy is going to be a lot lower, and you can start making plans ahead of time, all because you're connected to the grid and you're aware of these things. And of course, being aware doesn't go very far unless your building is smart. You've got to have a level of intelligence, you've got to have a level of measurement of energy flows. And lastly, the building has to be flexible. It's no good knowing about all these opportunities, but if you can't shift your load, if you can't change your load profile, and if you can't control your own local generation and energy storage, you certainly won't be able to profit from the opportunities. So if we looked at the building, what exactly would we be thinking of when it comes to this GEB? Well, first of all, connecting to the grid would be via a smart meter. You've probably heard of these smart meters. They've been deployed in the millions around the country, all the countries, and especially for commercial buildings. And coupling the smart meter with your building system, your BAS or your BMS allows you to start doing all these optimizations that we're talking about. In the building itself, you're going to have HVAC systems that are communicating with the BMS. You're, of course, going to have your own self-generation, rooftop PV. You might have diesel gensets, you might have biomass, but certainly a lot of local generation that would be managed and controlled. Okay. The big one, of course, is the bottom part here where we start looking at the battery storage. Also a thermal mass, chilled water, ice storage. And of course, the other big issue that's looming on the horizon is the electric vehicles themselves and the part they can play in optimizing the energy costs in a building. So around the world, we're seeing a number of organizations, all the way from America to Europe to elsewhere, focusing on GEBs. Over in Europe, they've called them energy flexible buildings for quite some time. And as you can see, a number of organizations are now promoting energy flexibility. One of them being the International Energy Agency. They've got an initiative, one of them Annex 67, which looks to manage and flatten the load profile, as you can see here. And they say a building which can manage its demand and generation according to local climate conditions, user needs, and grid requirements. That's their definition of an energy flexible building. So there's a number of names for this strange animal, the GEB, grid integrated, grid interactive energy flexibility, a number of names. But what is very clear is that these buildings are becoming profitable, and they can be seen as both a power station because they generate their own energy, and believe it or not, as a petrol station or a gas station, as you call it in America. The idea that buildings are able to become the natural home of electric vehicles is something that I don't think we quite appreciate. Here's a survey from the National Travel Survey done in the US, but I believe this applies to many buildings around countries around the world. And you can see the gray part is the time that a private vehicle, spends back at its home base, usually a home or a residential apartment of sorts. In the middle of the day, a good deal of the time, this dark blue is spent at the place of work, and then some time is also spent at other places, such as shopping centers and visits to medical centers and all sorts of things. Very little time, around about 10% of the time, the vehicle actually spends on the road. So if we look at that in another way and we say, well, during the daylight hours, the peak time around about 12 o'clock, up to 50% of the time the vehicle is in a commercial building happens during the middle of the day. Okay, the other 50% of the time it's either on the road or it's back at its home base or residential. So that's a tremendous opportunity. 50% of all the vehicles in the middle of the day are probably very close to or in close proximity to the building. And that means if they were to be connected to the building, there's many things that we can start thinking of. If we looked at, and I chose an Indian city which has 3.5 million private vehicles, according to the stats. As you know, we look up everything on Google. And if 50% of those private cars are connected to buildings during the day, we see some incredible numbers. So let's assume that of those 50% of cars, we've got about 1.4 million of them are small urban vehicles with a battery of about 30 kilowatt hour. Think of a Nissan Leaf, okay? Then about 350,000 of them are larger vehicles, such as a Tesla Model S or the Model 3 even, a fairly large battery of 80 kilowatt hours. When we sum all of that together, we realize that there's many megawatt hours of energy available. If those EVs, electric vehicles, are connected into buildings, a lot of that capacity is available to the building as a mobile energy storage unit that comes to your building. Also, it represents a market. Those vehicles need energy, and the building may well be able to sell them energy, probably at a profit. The other thing to consider is that these large batteries in electric vehicles have the ability to provide instantaneous power. So I've made the assumption that the instantaneous power available from a 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf battery is about 60 kilowatts. It's actually quite a bit higher, right? And then for the 80 kilowatt hour battery in, say, a Model S, the smaller Model S's, we could maybe draw 160 kilowatts from that battery. If you look at the available instantaneous power from these close to 2 million vehicles in a large city that are connected into buildings, you'll see that there's a massive, massive capacity available to buildings to help flatten the curve. And there's various business models and various games that you can start working on how the synergy between electric vehicles and buildings plays out. A lot of business models, and I think there's a lot of profit there. We keep hearing of the Bitcoin approaches and the various ways that you can buy and sell energy. Okay, so let's put that aside. Let's move on. The vehicle to building to grid is a very growing industry, as we've said. If you accept that buildings can generate their own energy and also interact with the grid, then you need to start looking for a framework for a new energy business model. And believe it or not, the framework is going to come probably from the work that ASHRAE has done. The facilities smart grid information model is probably going to be central to the business models of modern buildings. And believe it or not, it all started with ASHRAE. This facility smart grid information model was originally ASHRAE 201 in 2016 and has now become an ISO model. So ASHRAE, working with the smart grids people, the IEC is like the ISO except for the electrical market, have put together this bridge between the traditional utilities, the electrical providers, and the new electricity prosumer, in other words, the building itself. This particular information model is critical, and let's have a quick look at it here. I'd like to suggest that it's the most important standard that you've never heard of, and I'll explain why. First of all, we're going to jump into this. We're going to skim over this. I'm not going to go over it in detail. It's about 1,000 pages of documentation between the user case and the standards themselves. But they define, well, the standard defines four components: the load, which you're familiar with, the meter, a method of measuring, an energy manager, and some sort of generator. The generator could be PVs, it could be the diesel genset, it could be those batteries that come and go as the electric vehicles come and go. And these components are the main, let's call them nodes or components in any business model that you're going to put together, right? Now, why did I say it's the most important standard? It's because this particular component, the meter module, quite possibly will have a massive amount of money flowing through it. It's the interface between the building and the grid. And as we know, roughly 40% of all electrical energy in the world is used by buildings. So that orange block, the meter or the sub-meter, will handle the information flow about energy to the value of trillions of rupees, dollars, or euros. So that's got to be an important part of any business case. What you see over here is you've got your energy management modules, such as a thermostat, and it's controlling loads such as fans, chillers, air handling units. In other cases, You've got the energy management controlling the charging of electric vehicles, of storage, and in conjunction with smart meters, your lighting loads, all feeding the information backwards and forwards to the smart grid, negotiating better pricing on energy, doing the load shifting, the shaping. And the quickest way, I think, to look at it is to look at the sets of practical use cases spelt out by the facility smart grid information models. Okay, so I'm just going to run you through one of the many cases. I think, if I remember correctly, there's about 50 of them and growing. And the use case really gives you a good feel for what exactly this model is about. Right, so the first one, of course, is to manage demand to minimize cost. Your demand costs are becoming increasingly important, and if you can shift, shape, and shed loads, you can control your demand charges, right? And next one up, use case number 4, for example, is about balancing the power purchases between the utility and the on-site generation. So when do you really want to buy energy and when do you want to sell? Clearly, on the days the smart grid tells you that there's excess energy and the prices are low, you may well want to buy a good deal of energy, charge up your batteries, charge up your ice storage, your chilled water storage. Okay. Use case number 8, always a need to measure your plug loads, calculate costs, consumptions. And of course, the big one, if you're starting to look at green buildings, is understanding your emissions, your CO2, your energy costs, and compare that against benchmarking, which is what LEED does. And we know that ASHRAE has a number of benchmarking standards. Okay, you need to validate your energy consumption. There's audits that may be done. You need to perform M&V on your energy efficiency upgrades, because that's how you pay for these upgrades. And of course, determine your critical and curtailable loads. The big question is, what happens when you lose the grid? How can you limp along in a building that has some energy generation, but perhaps not enough to keep the entire building running? So you've got to identify loads that you can shed. Okay, all of this comes together in another ASHRAE document, which was released probably a year and a bit ago. It's the Smart Grid Application Guide on how to integrate your facilities. I mean, this could be a plant as well as a building. How to integrate all these buildings with the electric grid. And once again, it goes through the use cases and provides a lot of guidance. ASHRAE started, Stephen Bushby started working with the SEPA over in California, the Open ADR Alliance, many of the organizations looking ahead to where the smart grid's going. And they focused on how to put together a set of guidelines, a set of policies, and certainly to provide comfort to anybody who's thinking of connecting and integrating their buildings with the grid. I'm heading towards the end of this presentation, and of course the question is, and we heard all up from Rena about the smart grid, do the buildings at the moment need a smart grid before they can become grid interactive? And the answer is not necessarily. There's no need to wait for the smart grid. Sure, it's coming. The smart grid will eventually rule the future energy market. But right now, buildings can do things like monitor the grid frequency and the feeder voltage to understand the status of the energy that's been supplied. They can react to time of use tariffs and other time-based tariffs. And buildings, very definitely, as Sheila Hayter, the 2018 ASHRAE president, has said, buildings need to prepare themselves to manage not only the self-generation, but the energy flows to and from the grid. And probably one of the more important things, I think, is the day-ahead planning. If you know what the climate, what the weather is going to be like tomorrow, the price of energy tomorrow, you can start doing a lot of things to make your building far, far more profitable. So, in closing, I'd like to say a building's load profile, way back when, and we're thinking a few years ago, the load profile was thought of as untamed and at times unpredictable. It was what it was. Now we see the building and its load profile as being a good grid citizen, as seeking beneficial cooperation with the grid and seeking profits that can be made by cooperating not only with the grid, but of course with a vast fleet of electric vehicles that come and go. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Right. Thank you, Mike, for your great presentation on this topic, which is grid interactive. So I would like to ask Mr. Weber to please proceed with the next version.
Yeah, thank you, Mani. So from participants, do you have any question to ask?
Hello, Mike. I have a
Hi, I
question.
can hear you.
Yeah. So you talked about net zero buildings and how buildings should generate their own energy. I have a question. Do you think it's more feasible if we have large scale facilities that are more reliable and easy to maintain, and the grid will also be easily manageable to switch on and off in rapid responses to price signals? Also, it's more economical to add battery storage to large solar plants than to have it on individual households. Like, what is your view on that?
Yes, so that's a very valid question. Where and you're right. I mean, utility scale photovoltaics is a good deal less expensive than trying to put some PV onto your local roof. The big difference, though, is when your business model takes resiliency into account. It doesn't matter how much PV you got sitting out in the deserts or wind farms offshore, if you can't get that energy to your building and you've got problems with copper theft, you've got problems with typhoons, hurricanes destroying the grid, then your building is basically crippled. So I think whilst small scale PV installations are more expensive, I think you will find that there's a large interest in the value that the resiliency brings, having some level of generation on site. Lastly, I'd like to say, and you're 100% right, community microgrids, community energy systems probably make more sense. The idea that each individual building is going to be have all of this smartness and that might not happen immediately, but certainly groups of buildings in a campus can start playing the game by having community generation and community storage and of course community control systems. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Any more question?
Yeah, I have one more question. Sorry to bother you guys. Yeah. So, Mike, what do you think with more renewables coming into the market, we will have more power shortages because it's unpredictable in nature? What do you think should be the balance of renewable versus non-renewable, and how should grid can handle both of them?
That's one question that I think everybody in the world is busy debating. Could we have a 100% renewable grid? And I'm a member of the IEEE PES, the Power and Energy Society, and you can imagine that we have a lot of debates between the nuclear people and renewables, and of course the clean coal and the gas, and everybody's looking to supply energy to the grid. I don't think that bringing more renewables onto the grid can be a big issue if the loads become a lot more smarter. The energy flexibility And if you look at the ASHRAE paper, that position paper that Sheila Hayter and ASHRAE put together some years ago, the flexibility that you get from energy loads would certainly allow an entire country's grid to accommodate a lot more renewable energy. Certainly renewables are not dispatchable, but grid interactive buildings, their energy load is and can be dispatchable, the shedding, shifting, and shaping of the load. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. So there is one question from K. Akin. Are you concerned about managing cybersecurity with ubiquitous two-way communication?
Yeah, that's the big unknown at the moment. The protecting any building management system. Let's not talk about the grids itself. As ASHRAE members, or BIPSA members, I think our focus is more on the buildings. But protecting any building management system or energy information management system is a big issue. It's interesting that the US Department of Energy, though, does see microgrids and grid interactive buildings as being a very positive approach to protecting a nation's assets against interference in terms of the grid energy. So cybersecurity must and should play a very big part. And while the IEEE have done a huge amount of work in that area, I think the ASHRAE people are starting to look at that as well. Thank you.
I have a question. Saket here. So, Mike, what would be a future metric in a grid interactive building to define whether a building is performing well or not? So right now we have a naive metric called, say, EUI or EPI, right? Kilowatt hour per meter square per whatever. In the future, when the building is so interactive, how will you call, or what metric will you use to kind of rate a building as efficient?
It always comes down to money, doesn't it? There's a number of new metrics, and the grid interactive people over in the States are looking at a number of metrics. There's an interesting system called PEER that comes out of the United States Green Building Council, and load matching will play a very big part. When you get the set of slides, you'll see there's a link to a paper written, I think it was 2007, 2008, looking at metrics such as load matching. How well does the generation on site match that of a building? But there's a slew of new metrics that are needed. EUI is good, okay, but EUI is really a subset of load matching and a number of other metrics. I hope that answers your question.
I have, this is Mohandat Sharma from Delhi. Just you said there is an unbalance in renewable energy. So if we have one earth, one renewable energy grid, is it possible what use on this?
Okay, you were breaking up a bit there. Could I just
repeat my question?
please?
As you said before, there is an unbalance in the renewable energy grid, right? So is it possible that we have Earth one renewable energy grid? So what are your views on that?
Okay, so I think the question of the unbalance on the grid is perhaps alluding to the fact that renewable energy is non-dispatchable, and you have to balance the load with what happens in terms of generation. I suspect, though, that your question revolves around how this balance can be achieved, and I think the grid interactive buildings go a long way towards the flexibility needed to introduce more renewables onto the grid. I hope that answers your question. I didn't quite get all the detail. You were breaking up there.
So I was asking this about because renewable energy is available during the daytime. So during nighttime, renewable energy is absent. So we have to depend on the fossil fuel energy. So that's why I was asking this. It is possible to have renewable energy grid worldwide, create some balance.
Yeah, so long-term energy storage. Sorry, I've got a bad echo at the moment. Long-term energy storage, of course, inter-seasonal energy storage is one of the holy grails that people are looking at, and the ability to share energy between continents using DC transmission, of course, is something that's often spoken about. But I think the big question always is, people always tell you the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't shine at night. So how do we get around it? And if you have a look at the ASHRAE smart grid integration document, it has a fair amount of detail on how you're going to design buildings of the future. And a lot of energy storage, of course, is required. The cheapest energy storage is thermal energy storage, ice or hot or cold water. And I think we'll see district heating and cooling also playing a big part in how buildings of the future can coexist with the grid. Thanks.
Thank you.
You're always welcome to email your questions. Sometimes I might not pick up exactly what you were trying to get at, but if you email the questions, we can use the LinkedIn forums, the BIPSA LinkedIn forums, to answer any questions. Not only myself. Remember, I'm just a spectator. I'm based down here in South Africa watching the world go by. But if you take part in a lot of the BIPSA forums and the ASHRAE forums, you get to ask these questions to the real energy experts.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Is there any more question? So I guess no. Okay, so we conclude the session. Thank you, Mike, for this wonderful session, for sharing your views and knowledge so simplistically. I believe that with the integration of distributed energy sources, it had become important to manage the demand and supply for energy. And I'm sure that the grid interactive buildings will play an important role in energy transition. So I would like to thank ASHRAE Chandigarh, Mani Khanna, and ASHRAE South Africa chapter for organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank Ms. Reena from India Smart Grid Forum for sharing about the organization and her views. Thank you all attendees. Hope you enjoyed the session. You can access the webinar recording through the link that will be shared via email soon. Thank you once again. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody. Cheerio. Bye.